Good evening, members. We'll start with agenda item 1, apologies for absence.
Do you want to do the...
Oh, do you want to do this first?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I've jumped ahead.
I believe I'm going to have to say that Nicola Fissenden has apologised due to her non-returning of my text message asking whether she was indeed coming. It says that she's driving, so she may be stuck somewhere, but I have tried in the last half an hour-ish, so I have to put her down as apologise unless she arrives.
Lovely, thank you. Apologies when I jumped ahead. So I've been advised that there are no planned fire drills for tonight, but if the alarm does sound, Mrs Snook will ascertain the situation and provide further instructions. I would remind you that this meeting will be broadcast live and recorded for playback on the Maidstone Borough Council website, but will anyone else be recording the proceedings this evening? Members who are using mobile phones or tablets are asked to please ensure that these are on silent and are only being used for the purposes of the meeting. Yep, that's all right. Right, so agenda item 1, apologies. I have received apologies for absence from Councillor McLaughlin, Councillor Round and Councillor Titchener. And Councillor Fissenden, as per Councillor Cox's message at the start. We have no notifications of substitute members either. Agenda item 3, urgent items. I have agreed to take Appendix 1 to agenda item 11 as an urgent update on the item for the External Auditor's annual audit letter, which is not available when the agenda was published. Is that agreed? Agreed. Agenda item 4, notification of visiting members. There are none. Disclosures by members and officers. Are there any disclosures by members or officers this evening? None. Disclosures of lobbying. Has anyone been lobbied? No? Agenda item 7. I move that the items on the agenda be taken as public as proposed. Yeah. Agenda item 8, minutes of the meeting held on 16th of September 2019. I'll take them page by page. So starting with page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Are they all agreed? Thank you. Agenda item 9, questions and answers from members of the public. There are no questions this evening. Moving to the committee work programme on page 10. Mr Green, are you going to introduce this one?
I've nothing to add to the work programme that's in front of you, members.
Are there any questions? No? None? Moving on then, do we need to get that one green? Is that okay just to go? No, that's fine. Okay. Moving on then to agenda item 11, the External Auditor's annual letter. Mr Green, are you introducing this one as well?
I can introduce it, but I'll hand directly over to Liz Jackson from Grant Thornton to summarise it for us.
Thank you, through you, Chair. So this is our annual audit letter. It summarises the audit finance report that came to you at the last committee meeting, and obviously I noted from the minutes that you wanted to ask me some questions as the external auditor. So I thought if I give a bit of background that I know the Director of Finance, Mark Green, has given to you, but just as a bit of a background and then kind of open the floor up, really kind of if you just want to ask me questions probably instead of actually going through what is a summary report of what you've already had presented to you. Grant Thornton, alongside all the other audit firms, did struggle to deliver the audit opinions this year. And as in your later report, that your response from the Council to the Redmond Review, over 40% of audits weren't signed by the end of July, which is the target date for auditors to give their opinion. It is not a statutory deadline for us. You have a statutory deadline to publish your accounts, whether they are audited or not, by the 31st of July. But there is not a statutory deadline for us to meet that deadline yourselves. So, We had resourcing issues. We have, on your audit, there are 2 auditors who make up the team. Below me, there's me, and then there's Tina, who you've met before as the manager. And then there is something called an in-charge, which is basically an executive, a qualified member of the team. And then there is a junior, an associate. In mid-May, our executive resigned and left the firm in the beginning of June. And our associate, sadly, was in a car accident at another council, so therefore we had no team. I rang the Director of Finance to say, actually, we need to pull the audit. We will not deliver it. I don't currently have a team. We have a full workload to deliver across all the other councils as well. We were already aware that we were not going to meet all the deadlines, all the accounts that we were delivering because of staff shortages, sickness, lots of that. Sadly, lots of Kent audits actually got affected. So it was not just you who weren't delivered by the end of July. There were multiple ones in Kent due to sickness and things that we had to take into account. So we had that conversation. We then tried to do the audit. So we came in towards probably about the mid-July to kind of do lots of the work. We'd sent out sample requests and that so the finance team could start working on things, and they'd had our working paper requirements to be able to actually go through all the working papers that were required to actually for us to complete the audit. We then came on site and we carried out the audit. We worked well with officers to actually try and deliver the audit as it was. The accounts you would have seen from the audit finance report presented to you in September, there were a number of amendments to them. As the statutory auditor who actually signs that audit opinion and puts my name to it and my professional standards, we did not have sufficient information. We had audit work outstanding. We did not have all the evidence that was required to be able to meet and sign off those accounts that I was satisfied were true and fair and correct until the 16th of August. And that is then when I issued the unqualified audit opinion. We had a number of amendments to the accounts based on the audit work that we had, and we had multiple changes to those accounts in the final versions that we had. So for me, it's my professional reputation if I'd signed those accounts early. So I understand that members and officers, which I've had multiple conversations around, are deeply disappointed that we did not meet the deadline for it. We've put in place already with officers about how to work differently next year. I think you'll see from the Redmond review, a whole review of the audit firms are underway in the fact that audit, as it currently stands, is not fit for purpose. That's not necessarily saying that Grant Thornton isn't fit for purpose or that myself isn't fit for purpose. It's actually the whole audit market hasn't been. I've been part of Maidstone for a number of years. I've worked in Kent my whole career of the 17 years. I've been an external auditor, and the fees have dramatically reduced. And with that, it means that the number of days that we have for the audit also have reduced on that basis. I spoke to another audit committee recently, and they said, but you're still making a big profit. And I've said to them, that's not to make anyone feel sorry for me in this room, but if we were actually tendering and we were trying to win the market as it currently stands with the regulation that's required and the work that has increased since the 2 years ago when we did the tender, we would not be tendering for audits on this basis because it is not deliverable and it's not safe. And for me, myself, we had multiple conversations, and I just said, actually, as someone who is signing those accounts and putting my professional standards on the line, I'm going to do it when I feel comfortable that we have the right level of evidence required to do that. So I'll now open up the floor to what will no doubt.
Thank you. Members, are there any questions? Councillor Perry?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This, I assume, this is a problem with local government audits, is it, rather than anything else? Is it specific to that? Sorry,
Through you, Chair. It is an extent to the public services, particularly local government. NHS, we tender on a different basis. So if you all remember 2 years ago, for the NHS audits, they procure it individually. So we go and we kind of like a bit of a fancy panel. We sit, we get asked questions, we bid individually for that audit. For local government, the vast majority, I think over 90% of audited bodies, chose to actually go with the PSAA, their appointment route. And that has been, whether it's successful or not is still to be determined. For our private sector arm, and you'll have seen in the press that all the firms are doing it currently, they are all increasing their fees and people are withdrawing audit. withdrawn a number of high-profile audits, a couple of our FTSE audits as a firm. We've just said, actually, the fees that we're getting, the regulatory risk related to those audits, just not worth being in that audit frame anymore.
Yeah, this is interesting, isn't it? I mean, I sat on this audit committee for a number of years now. One of the things I've noticed, actually, the audit fees seem to either stayed the same or gone down, actually. That kind of surprised me. I come from an accountancy background myself, and I did used to work for one of the big firms. And it just kind of surprised me because it just didn't make sense. I could see that, and I could see where you were coming from. One thing I would say on this, and I think auditing has gone through a lot of, how should I put this? His reputation has been slightly tarnished, I think, hasn't it? Not just not in local, but in the whole public arena. And I totally support what you did, actually. I think by not being rushed in to sign something that you were professionally unhappy with, I totally support, actually. Because I think you made absolutely the right decision. If it meant a delay, fine, you know, because there's been too many examples, I think, maybe if, I won't quote the firms, but where they've signed off under pressure maybe, and it hasn't worked out very well, has it? So, and I think we are, obviously, it's public money we are responsible for here. So I can honestly say this for the record, I think you absolutely made the right decision. And I support what you said, because I think that's absolutely right. I'd be much more reassured by what you're saying than if you'd rushed in and produced something and signed something. So professionally, you're absolutely spot on, I think. Thank you.
Members, are there any other comments? Yeah.
An unfair question, so apologies. With the benefit of your experience of this audit, what volume of resource do you think, is it times 1 and a bit, 2, 3, to actually have ended up on time with a product, an end result that you would professionally have been comfortable with? What are we talking about as an increase? And you clearly can't be held to it. What is your broad thinking?
Through you, Chair. My broad thinking would be about another 10 days resource. So we budgeted for the audit to be 2 people for 2.5 weeks. That was 26 days resource going into at the junior level for actually delivering the accounts audit. I personally feel that if we had another person for that for 10 days, that would help deliver it. And we're doing more work with the finance officers to try and do early work, and we're looking at changing our approach, and we're currently speaking with the Financial Reporting Council, who are our regulator, to see something that we do for substantive testing. There's lots of the sample testing we do. When you do early work, which we call interim audit, we have to then reconcile in the ledger at year end. So all the population that we've tested part year, we then have to get your final year ledger. That all has to be mashed together and proves that is the figures in the accounts. That is a very difficult thing to do. So we're currently liaising with the FRC to see if we can do a different analysis, which will save 2, 3, if not 4 days of work at year end.
And a follow-on, if I may, given the budget that you had, and it's not meant to be a rude question at all, were you able to get hold of internally the experience of staff? Do I want to use the word calibre of staff? And it is a very rude question. Could you get the experience and calibre that you really needed for this?
No, in July is the honest answer. In the fact that obviously, all the staff, we have a rule in public services that we only use public services people. So we don't just bring in people from all over the firm to actually come and do audit, because we say they don't understand local government accounts. Actually, we want that specialist knowledge. We do quarterly training and things like that, so people are aware of the issues that are facing. And actually, to bring in people, that would put more risk, not only on me, but actually on the quality of the audit we were delivering. So from that perspective, we did have quality trained people who were all public services. They just came in August when other audits were complete.
Thank you. Is there anything else anyone wants to add? No? In that case, then we'll turn to the recommendation on page 12. There is one recommendation for noting. Members, is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 12, the audit progress report and sector update. I believe that's back to you again, Liz.
Chair. I wasn't going to say much on this, only to say that we are currently auditing your housing benefit grant claim with your shared service. We have been having bi-weekly calls with them to ensure we don't miss the deadline, and we've had weekly calls throughout November. There are still work that they are doing. The council's elected for the shared service to do majority of the testing themselves, and internal audit have also been part of that process as well. So we are waiting for some information from the shared service, but we have said to them we do not want to miss the deadline after the accounts experience, and we are chasing them daily to ensure that we get the information that we need by the deadline, at what we need it to be able to meet the deadline. And that's probably all I was going to say on this agenda item.
Thank you. Members, are there any comments on this report?
Only a trite comment, Chairman, is to say, when you're talking about deadlines, I noticed that you've missed at least 2 deadlines with Brexit. So, I mean, I just wondered if you could actually come up with a figure that we can all agree on. Thank you very much. But no, the deadlines are important, of course. Yes, thank you.
Councillor.
Thank you very much, Chairman. My only question to you was, you said you've had to chase on a virtual daily basis. Is that just so people realise it's important, or are there things that they do in one day and then you need to have that figure to input it again, or do you feel that our staff are needing to be chased daily?
Through you, Chair. I think there are limited resources within the shared service of the people who are dealing with us, and we have conversations, we have weekly calls, we agree all the action points, we then put those in emails to ensure that everyone is aware of the action points. We'll be like 3 days later and we'll be like, where is what you've sent us? We can't do what we need until you give us the report, then pick the sample, then it's got to be tested and all of that. So we are chasing because we don't want to be in the situation where I sit here next committee to say, this is the situation that we're in. I think it's working much better than last year. If anyone who was on the committee last year remembers, we did miss the deadline last year because the work was all delayed. I think that's why we're very conscious to be chasing on a regular basis to ensure that we get there as much as we can do.
Can I just ask then that the chairman might relay that back after hearing that and say to the relevant members of staff or officers that I hope this is not something we're missing out on repeatedly, but it is just the amount of work that has to be got through and back to Grant Thornton, because we don't want to miss that deadline, and I'm sure they don't either. If it's extra resource our end, if they've gone down on their resource and we've got to produce more information, I think we should obviously just pass that back and say, please be wary that that's why we're paying less, because we're doing more our side. So if you think that's apt.
Mr. Green, is that something we can follow up on afterwards?
Certainly, I can pass that back to Revenues and Benefits.
Thank you. Councillor Atkins.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Still on deadlines, effectively. On page 24 of our report, there's a thing from Grant Thornton here saying they're planning the audit in December. Well, would it be a better idea to start planning the audit maybe a month earlier? Then you might be able to deliver it a month earlier.
We carry out multiple audits for what we call the planning and the interim stage of the audit between roughly November, but because the benefits have been delayed at a number of places, then that's all moved to December. But the real crunch period is in that June and July, where we have a huge number of audits that need to be audited and a finite number of staff. So when something gets a knock-on effect, or we lose staff through sickness, that's when we have the problems. The planning work in December is the natural time of when we do it, to then bring you the audit plan at the next audit committee.
Councillor Perry.
Yeah, it's very interesting, some of the things in this whole paper. It's on page 28. It's just fascinating me slightly. This is the SIP for CFO confidence survey, which I had a look at, and maybe our financial officer maybe would comment on this, because it comes out some quite sort of scary things about a loss of confidence in particular financial positions, and it talks in districts the greatest pressures for housing, cultural services and environmental services. And I wonder if you could comment on that just a little bit, because when I read it, I thought, what's this really all about? Maybe I'm being scared for no reason at all, but it is slightly, worry me. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd certainly agree about housing services, because that is an area where we can't control the amount of money we spend. I mean, we have to deal with people who present as homeless, and so there's that element which we only have a certain amount of control over. I think at Maidstone, over the past 2 or 3 years, we have actually got to grips with housing pressures very effectively. Other authorities are catching up a bit, but definitely of those things, I think housing is an area of concern. Districts obviously don't face the same kind of pressures that upper tier authorities do, though, with social services, which is obviously it's alluded to here as a huge area of pressure.
Thank you. Members, are there any other questions? No? In that case, then we turn to page 16 for the recommendations. Again, there is one recommendation here for noting. Noted. Thank you. Agenda item 13, then, the internal audit interim report. Mr. Clark, could you please introduce?
Thank you, Chair. This is our regular report to the Audit Committee at this time of year, summarising the progress we've made so far towards implementing the audit and assurance plan that members approved a few months ago. I'll go through the report in brief, and then I'm happy to take any questions members have. Firstly, on page 40 in the pack, there's a couple of things that I'm bound to say to members each time, and members of longer standing have heard me say similar before. Firstly, to confirm that we continue to work in full independence and we've not been subject to undue pressure by members or officers. And secondly, that I'm satisfied that management have not responded inappropriately to any risks that we've raised. As you'll see in the detail, there continues to be a good response to the recommendations that we raise, and management are accepting of the issues that we bring to them. Finally, at the bottom of that page, to highlight on resourcing, I'm always very pleased to see members of the audit team develop their skills and seek promotions, even when those promotions take them beyond our shores to other authorities. Having 3 of them do so at once presents something of a resource challenge, but one that I'm satisfied that we've got the resilience in the team, and certainly with the links we've made with contractors elsewhere, that we can bridge that gap and hopefully look forward to some new recruits joining us in the new year. From page 41 onwards is the detail of the work we've done so far. We're only a few months into the audit year, which typically we look at starting in June to ally with the opinion. And on page 42 and 43 runs through some of the findings of the reports that we've issued since I last came to members in July. We've issued 5 assurance rated reports since then, and they've all had a sound rating, which is, in our parlance, a positive assurance rating indicative of controls working well. So on that basis, I've got no particular issues that I'd want to highlight to members at this time. But from page 43 onwards, for the following few pages, as is usual with these reports, we go through the executive summary of those 5 reviews so that members can see the overall picture of that we found and the sorts of recommendations and issues that we identified. Page 48 deals with the agreed actions and following up those actions. As I say, we've continued to have a good response from officers to addressing those actions. There are 4 high priority actions which have been deferred past their originally agreed date, which I describe in some further detail at the foot of page 48. But we're satisfied in all of those cases that officers are on top of the issues as they develop, and we're looking forward to full implementation of those in due course. On page 50 of the report, we go into some of the broader work that we do to look at assurance across the authority, risk management, you'll see in some detail at the next meeting. On counter-fraud, we continue to investigate issues that are raised with us. We've completed a couple of investigations, have one ongoing, but there's nothing that I want to bring to members' attention at this time. Safe to say that we continue to be grateful for the cooperation of officers in pursuing those investigations. We also take the lead at the Council at looking at various elements of the National Fraud Initiative, which is the data matching exercise. We provide a whole suite of data to the Cabinet Office, who match it with various public and private sector bodies across the country and return to us matches which are potential fraud or errors for us to investigate. It's not been a particularly strong crop this year. From 108 we've looked at, we found one error, but of course you don't know until you look. And we hope to complete that work over the remainder of the year. And across pages 51 and 52, talk about some broader work we've taken on looking at serious case reviews from the Council, issues that come up through safeguarding boards, which are where there's been a fatality or a particular issue. We and all the other public authorities who have had any contact with the individuals or families involved take the opportunity to step back and reflect on our relations with those individuals and whether there are any improvements that can be made. So there are no particular issues I want to highlight to members, but members might be reassured to know that such processes go on and such reflections take place. And finally from that, as Ms Jackson has already mentioned, we've been working with the housing benefit data. It so happens that we've got a couple of people in the team who've got particular expertise. We've got a couple of former benefits assessors, and I myself for some time led the Audit Commission's housing benefit grant certification work in London. So we felt we were quite well placed to be able to take some of the strain of this work, which has a direct financial benefit, because if we weren't doing it, Grant Thornton would, and would be naturally charging us for their services. Ms Jackson's mentioned that there's we're ramping up the pace as the deadline approaches, just to iron out the final issues, but I wanted to say thanks for the support that we've been given for Grant Thornton. It's a new process for us, and we've been working with the workbooks, and the training that they delivered have been very helpful, and I share your confidence that we will be able to get to the deadline with the work complete. Finally, on page 53, some sections about the audit service, about our conformance with the Code of Ethics, and the thing that I'd want to highlight from that is, as you will have heard me say before, this year is the year where we as auditors are ourselves subject to audit as an external quality assessment. I've prepared an invitation to tender for that, which certainly I circulated to the Chair and Vice Chair for their thoughts earlier at the end of last week. We're hoping to go out to tender at the end of this month with a view to getting the review in the early part of 2020 and reporting its results to you next spring or maybe summer, depending on the timelines of the successful bidder. But in the meantime, my provisional conclusion based on self-assessment is that we remain in conformance with audit standards. I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, and thank you for that very comprehensive report. Councillor Cox, you wanted to speak?
Thank you very much, Chair. On page 50, item 44, it says that there was one complaint. Is this something that we shouldn't really want to open up again? Has it been sorted, put to bed, and to a satisfactory resolution?
As we've put there, the allegation came in from a member of the public. We investigated the allegation, including the evidence that they'd provided. We found there was no basis to the allegation. We invited the member of the public to provide further evidence if they felt they had it, and they did not respond. So we considered the matter closed.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very thorough report, and I hope when I'm playing Scrabble, I'll be able to put ANCE if I see conform, because I've never seen it. Thank you.
Councillor Daly?
Well, Chairman, I'm following up on what Mr. Cox has said on this question of allegations. Whilst it might have been on this particular occasion a direct allegation made to the department, I have actually seen allegations of this nature on a wider basis. It's been on Facebook and it's been here now. You know, people trousering money, people, the planning department must have done this and done that and sort of. And these allegations are insidious, in my view, because, you know, people get this funny feeling that there's something going on. Now, my view is that it may very well be that you put it to bed and he didn't respond. But my feeling is that these people should be called to account. And if you make an allegation that somebody's engaged in fraud or is taking a bribe or something of that nature, if it's not substantiated and not followed up through and proved to be one way or the other, then that's it. But the person making that allegation has got to be able to stand behind what they've said. And I just think it's just awful that they get away with it by, they didn't respond, so right, it's gone, that's it, finish. Because it's not satisfied, in my view, and I think it ought to be. So it's just a dreadful thing. It's not the first time it's happened, and it does raise its head from time to time, depending on the case. But if people are going to make these allegations, well, I think they should be challenged, quite frankly. And I wouldn't mind issuing them with a writ, but there you go, but that would have to be somebody else's decision. But if anybody accused me of something, personally, and I felt strongly that, and I know jolly well that I hadn't, whatever it was, I would challenge it. I would challenge it to the end, because I think it ought to be done. A name is a name, and your name is very precious. And I think particularly in your job as auditor, you've got a responsibility, and you carry it out to the full, as far as I can see, because these reports are extremely detailed and very, very full. And I keep praising you year after year. You get fed up with it, I know you will, but that's not the point, is it? The job is done. The job is not an easy job to do. We did have some fraud some years ago, in my remembrance, to do with money going into parking meters. But that was dealt with, and was dealt with properly. And there were people who were guilty in that case, and they paid the penalty. But in this particular case, it's these allegations of nasty, snide comments and they are really basically allegations which could damage somebody. People are in jobs, stressful jobs. And on top of all that, to have to deal with that, I think it's just not done. So I just ask you specifically, please, will you make sure anybody making these allegations is chaste, and really chaste, and not just, well, they didn't reply, so put it to one side. Because to me, it's important. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I do agree with what you said. It's the balance to be struck with these things is that if people have concerns of impropriety, we want them to come forward with those concerns. We want that kind of information that enables us to investigate. The general mood music or the non-specific allegations is one thing, but in this instance we had specific allegation against a named individual at a specific time, so there is something there to investigate, and so investigate we did. You're right that being subject to an allegation is intensely stressful as an experience, and so we sought to do the investigation as swiftly and decisively as possible. So it was up and down within a week or so with the investigation. We were able to feed back to the individual our conclusions as swiftly as we could. Naturally, we had to give the opportunity to provide further evidence if such existed, and when it didn't come forward, we closed the book on that. As for pursuing people, it's a case-by-case decision you have to take, because we want people to come forward, we want people to share their concerns, we don't want people to be worried about if they get something wrong in an allegation, we'll come after them even if they raised it in good faith. On this specific instance, that it was sort of tied to a wider council action that we let continue. But yes, generally, that would be something that we would consider, and certainly we would always consider whether we felt the allegation had been raised in good faith, the quality of the source, if you will, when deciding to take things forward.
Thank you. Councillor Atkins.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I share Councillor Daly's concerns, but the problem is that lots of things on social media, they're hiding behind the cloak of anonymity with stupid pseudonyms, and they're very, very difficult to actually find who is behind them. So, I mean, if there are any specific allegations, would you consider it worthwhile financially to chase these up? Because I know it's an expensive, time-consuming business, so would it be worthwhile if there are specific allegations about specific officers, would you actually want to follow it through and try to find out who it actually is?
I say we always evaluate the source. So if an allegation comes in that doesn't stack up on the face of it and it comes from an anonymous source that we can't inquire any further over, it's likely that we wouldn't take that further just because there's nothing there to take further and we can't talk to the source. But that's a value judgment to take, and sometimes we will get information that comes in that does have a level of specificity that warrants looking at further. The allegation is on the face of it credible. But that's what we undertake the investigation for, and that's what we seek to learn. And in this case, we are satisfied that the allegation was unfounded. But it's one of those things, like I said, with the NFI, I wouldn't be able to say that positively until we looked. So we evaluate the source, we consider whether an allegation is credible and worth investigating, and if it is, under the counter-fraud policy that members approved last year, and we'll see again next time you meet, we take that investigation forward as appropriate.
Thank you, Chairman. I take the point, and I understand that entirely. If I just made one more point on this. On the same page, on page 50, item 50, on page 50, item 43 is intriguing. It doesn't tell us anything at all other than it just raises interest. Is the near future, the due course, going to be soon? Am I going to be old enough to understand it when I get it?
I mean, on that specific investigation, we mention it here partly just to reassure members that we're not just doing all this by ourselves. We are liaising with the police and agencies of the police where circumstances make that the right course of action. I understand that NATIS will be back to us, the National Investigation Service will be back to us with a view by the end of this month. We are promised about whether that is something that they wish to take forward or whether it's something that they feel doesn't stand a realistic chance of prosecution and say they would not take forward. So the next time I report to you, I expect to be able to give you one of those two conclusions.
Councillor Atkinson.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to say, what if it's a malicious accusation against an officer? Would you then try to find out who the person was and then proceed with some sort of prosecution?
I think we'd have to take that case by case. An investigation into who made a malicious allegation is itself time-consuming, as you would expect. And so that's something that I would want to discuss with Mark and others in CLT about the merits of taking an investigation of that sort forward. Theoretically, the council has powers to prosecute that sort of offence, but we would have to consider the practicalities in individual circumstances as to whether we would take that forward.
I'll just say that's fair enough. Thank you.
Councillor Titchener, did you want to come back in on this point? Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Not on that point. Have a slightly different point. Shall I continue?
I'll bring Councillor Perry in first because he's been waiting for a while, and I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is a slightly different tack, but I was... first of all, Rich, I do appreciate your reports. I mean, I think they're pretty fantastic, actually, and really good. And I know Councillor Daly, I'm repeating what Councillor Daly's already said, but one thing that just intrigued me slightly was on your pages 44 and your summary results, you tend to give sound controls. You don't, I haven't yet seen the top ranking strong control. Does that mean there's room to manoeuvre in your reporting, or are you just sort of taking a sort of conservative approach to it. I mean, in a small c, not political. Thank you.
Yeah, Strong does exist. Maidstone Council have seen them before, and I dare say will do again. It's, on this particular crop, it hasn't occurred. What I say is, for the strong assurance rating, we would typically look for services to be demonstrating best practice or things that make them stand out amongst the authorities that we analyse and further beyond that. But a sound assurance rating is a good one. It's a service that's working well, and I would encourage them to have no problems with that and not necessarily have any ambitions to move up. Or to have a strong assurance rating. Sound is perfectly satisfactory, and in an organisation that's looking to manage its limited resources as Maidstone and all other local authorities are, it's a perfectly good ambition to aim for.
Councillor Calling.
Thank you very much. Slightly different point. On your assurance projects, and I am a few months out of date now, I see no sign of contract management. Is that likely to come onto your radar in the not too distant future? Because my few months out of date memory tells me that there were a few concerns in that area.
We last looked at contract management in it was published, I think, in the autumn of 2018. So typically we wouldn't do a full follow-up review quite this quickly, because at the moment our focus is on the agreed actions coming out of that review a year ago and helping the authority or reviewing the implementation of those actions and give them some time to those revised arrangements to actually work and to function before we would come back and take a new review. So I don't believe it's on the plan to do a full review for 1920, but it's certainly something that we would be in the running for a full review in 2020-21, because by that point the actions will have been taken and the improvements hopefully embedded to the extent that a full review would uncover them or see them.
Thank you very much for that. A slightly a more general question, and it touches on what we're likely to talk about on agenda item 17, but follows on from the session we had in the other room. It is a leading question. You're part of a shared service. Are there any downsides to Maidstone Borough Council trying to be an exemplar council? Are there any downsides to internal audit being shared with other authorities rather than being unilaterally dedicated to the borough?
No, I don't think there are. I think it's well, I would say that, wouldn't I? But it's considerable upsides. Considerable upsides. We've got access to a level of expertise and resources that a single local authority audit service would typically be 2 people. So I mean, I say in this report about we've had 3 people move on into promotions. That would be fatal for a single authority service, whereas it's something that we can support and watch our team grow and bring the resilience in from elsewhere. So, I mean, I could talk at length about the benefits of shared service, but I'm mindful of Councillor Cox's comments to favour my original answer, which was no.
Members, are there any other comments?
Yes, could I just come in support of what Richard said? Because I think on page 40, where you talk about the independence of internal audit, the fact it is a shared service, you're not part of one particular authority, I think gives more reassurance in this actually, and I think really works. And I mean, the standard of service we get is extremely good, we all know that. So I think it supports that. So I go along with what's been said. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Right, members, if there are no further comments, we turn to the recommendations on page 34. This is another report for noting. Is that agreed? Thank you. Agenda item 14 then, Maidstone Property Holdings. Mr Green, could you please introduce?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Maidstone Property Holdings was set up in 2016, and internal audit carried out a review the following year when the company was still quite early in its existence. At that stage, it was just letting properties in Granada House. And I guess that what internal audit did then was to make sure that we would repair the roof while the sun was shining. They put in some recommendations which were fully accepted to make sure that the company would be fit for purpose as it grew, and it has grown. More properties have been taken on, Lenworth House, there's more to come. And the recommendations that internal audit made were about improving the oversight arrangements by the council, making sure there was a clear operational agreement with the council about what the property companies should do, to put in an SLA, to be clear about the company's objectives. And there was a report to this committee last year just feeding back on the internal audit report and letting members know that we were adopting the recommendations. And those have now been implemented, and they have meant quite a few additional things that we've done, which are set out in paragraph 2.4. These were agreed by Policy and Resources Committee back in July. But in short, what they did was to make sure there was clarity about the respective responsibilities of the council and the property company. They put in place a business plan for the property company. They updated the operational agreement. They made sure there was a service agreement. So I believe we really now have a strong governance structure for Maidstone Property Holdings, and that's set out in the report. The way it works is that the company has 4 directors, Director of Regeneration and Place, Head of Housing and Community Services, Head of Commissioning and Business Improvement, and a member of the legal team. The company is a subsidiary of the council, so the council exercises its responsibility as a shareholder through Policy and Resources Committee, and the Policy and Resources Committee delegates that responsibility to me, so I attend the board meetings of Maidstone Property Holdings, and I can bring along members if members have any issues that they may want to raise. The way that the property company works is very transparent. So I think we've done all the things that internal audit expected us to do, and as I say, that's summarised in the report, but very happy to take any questions that members may have on the operation of the company or how we've implemented the audit recommendations.
Councillor Cox.
Mr Green, it says on page 60, and I wasn't aware of this, at 5.2, there is also provision for representatives of the council to attend and observe board meetings. Where are the dates of those made, either known to us or public?
I can make sure that that information is circulated to, I think it's probably to members of Policy and Resources Committee, as that's the relevant committee, but I'm happy to circulate that information.
Councillor Atkinson.
Yeah, thank you. On the same paragraph, it says provision for representatives of the council to attend. It says it's agreed this will generally be the Director of Finance and Business Improvement. There's no mention of elected members there, and I think there should be a specific mention of elected members rather than just representatives. So I'd like to make that specific in there, because otherwise there'll be accusations of deals being done behind closed doors, smoke-filled rooms and all that stuff which has gone on in the past. I mean, I'm not saying it would happen, but I'd like to make sure that there's no possibility that it can. So I think it should be clarified that it does mean actual elected members of the council. Thank you.
Yes, I refer back to my answer to the previous question. The members of the Policy and Resources Committee are very welcome to attend those meetings. Clearly, I attend as a default position to make sure there is council representation, but members are very welcome to attend too, and I'm happy to confirm that, and we can make a note of that in the minutes if that helps, Councillor Atkinson.
Councillor Daly.
Yeah, Chairman, following on from Councillor Atkinson, for any elected member to be part of the board of this limited company, which is within the council's purview anyway, all the directors which are there at the moment are there specifically because of the jobs they hold and the professional attitude to the business in hand. An elected member to be part of that board would have to be of equal standing, in my view. In other words, they'd have to have a reason for being there and an understanding of what was going on. So if it's to do with property or with business or finance or one thing, it's all very well. But I mean, this committee is the overseeing of the performance of that borough property company limited. So I mean, it's already dealt with. Elected members are involved, but in proxy and or a long arm distance. I mean, they shouldn't be part of the board, I don't believe, anyway.
Councillor Calling.
Thank you. Councillor Daly said this committee may have some sort of oversight role, but is there any merit, it's just an open question, is there any merit in there being an annual meeting of this company which is open to members of the public?
Well, it'll have an annual meeting, as any company does, at which the member, which is the council, can attend. I'm not sure that it would be appropriate for members of the public to be able to attend, because after all it is a subsidiary of the council, so the council and its representatives can attend, but I don't think it's necessary for it to be open to members of the public.
Okay, so will this committee have on its programme somewhere or other to hear a presentation of the performance of that subsidiary company and what it plans to do?
Yes, the way that it works is that there's a report that goes to Policy and Resources Committee every quarter, which feeds back on the performance of Maidstone Property Holdings. And indeed, this Wednesday's meeting of Policy and Resources Committee will receive that information. So that's the way in which the activities of Maidstone Property Holdings are reported back to Policy and Resources Committee.
A final question, if I may, an open question. Does this committee have any role in reviewing the various documents, the services agreement, operational agreement, etc., the business plan? Should we be looking at any documents pertinent to the recent past operation and intentions of this company?
I may ask Mr. Clark to comment on this. I think if this committee was interested in the activities of Maidstone Property Holdings, probably the way to do it would be to make sure that, and in fact this is the case, that Maidstone Property Holdings is covered as part of the internal audit programme, and it could be done in that way. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Rich, as to what you're planning to do in relation to the company.
Sure. I mean, an important point to note is that we are the council's internal auditors. We are not appointed to be the company's internal auditors, so that's a line I've got to be very careful of in our planning. But certainly, insofar as the council's arrangements exist to help it monitor and oversee the company, that is part of our audit universe, as it were. It was before, which is why we did the review in 2017 in the first place, and it is now still, and so it is something that we will look at in due course after a risk assessment. But our focus will be on how the council uses its powers to oversee and direct the company, rather than the operations of the company itself, if you get my distinction there.
Mr. Clark, when you did that internal audit in 2016, were there any items from that are still outstanding that need to be dealt with, or are they all resolved now?
I believe that they're all resolved.
Thank you. Members, are there any other questions? Councillor Daly.
Just one thing, Chairman. As far as I understand it, the Property Services Company Limited is not in the business of speculative property purchase. If it was, I think it would be a different set of circumstances. In other words, they'd not be using capital raised through borrowing via the council to purchase a building which they're not going to occupy themselves, but are going to rent out to other people with an object in 4 or 5 years' time, selling it on and buying in and making a vast profit. I don't think they're in that business at all, are they?
You're absolutely right, Councillor Daly. I mean, the business of the company is managing that property, so it collects rents from the tenants. It is a fairly low-risk activity.
Members, if there are no other comments, we turn to the recommendation on page 56. There is one recommendation that the report is noted. Is that noted? Thank you. Agenda item 15, the Treasury Management Mid-Year Review. Mr Green, could you please introduce?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The Council's adopted the SIP for Treasury Management Public Services Code, under which we report to you regularly on our Treasury Management activity, and this is the half-yearly report on the implementation of the strategy. The main strands in the strategy are that we use cash for our capital investment to the extent that we're able to, rather than borrowing. So we're still in a position where we haven't borrowed to finance our capital programme. And the other thing that was a strand in the strategy was that we aim to diversify our cash holdings, so we are not putting all of our eggs in one basket. You'll see in the appendix that the balances of nearly 28 million that we held at the end of September are spread amongst a number of different places. So the report confirms that we're following the strategy. We set out in Appendix A our investments at the end of September 2019. We show in Appendix B how we performed in relation to the indicators that we set ourselves. And I've mentioned already that so far we haven't had to borrow to fund the capital programme. We almost certainly will be borrowing before the end of the financial year. And although originally the intention was that we would be borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board, members may know that the cost of borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board has gone up recently, so we'll be looking for a range of different ways of borrowing to look at what's going to be most cost effective for us. But I'm confident that we will be able to borrow relatively cheaply to fund the capital programme as and when we need to do so. So that's the report in a nutshell. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have on the detail in here.
Councillor Cooley.
I'm sorry to be a pain as the council is about to move into the market, and with obviously the benefit of 2020 hindsight, which is unreal. But looking back, the cost of carrying, I mean, should we have borrowed earlier? Because as I understand it, Public Works Loan Board rate is about to go up. So hindsight, we can't criticise for not having 2020 hindsight. I haven't got it. But with hindsight, should we have borrowed earlier and carried the cost until we needed it?
It's a fair question, and all the way through, I've been very open with members about the policy of not borrowing. The problem with borrowing was that we would have been holding large cash balances on which we'd have been earning practically nothing. And at the moment, it's still the case that we can borrow very cheaply. So I don't think there's necessarily a missed opportunity there. We are obviously watching what's happening to interest rates all the time. All the indications are at the moment that interest rates will will remain low for the foreseeable future. Yeah, clearly we need to be on our guard to make sure that if there's the risk of interest rates going up, that we do lock into the current low rates. But I don't think we've missed a trick by not borrowing before the PLB rates went up.
Members, are there any other questions? No? In that case, then we turn to the recommendations on page 63. There are two recommendations. The first is to be noted, and are they both agreed? Agreed. Perfect. Thank you. Turning then to page 74 for agenda item 16, the budget strategy risk assessment update. Mr. Green, could you please introduce?
Thank you. Me again. This is the report that I bring to each meeting of this committee, setting out the current assessment of the budget risks that the council faces. And since the last meeting of the committee, there's been a few things that have changed. One negative, which I've already alluded to, and the other two more positive. And the changes that I've proposed in the risk assessment are summarised on page 78. First of all, the point about borrowing for capital expenditure becoming more expensive. That in itself isn't a problem, but I think that the risk of the government rationing borrowing, restricting local authorities' ability to borrow, I think that is something that we need to keep an eye on. And so the risk that the capital programme cannot be funded, I've increased that to a moderate risk. I still think it's only moderate, but I did want to flag that up as a slightly increased risk. On the other hand, the two big risks that were highlighted in the last report have receded somewhat. We had this risk about the adverse financial consequences from a disorderly Brexit. Back in September, we were faced with the risk of a no-deal Brexit. Obviously, there's now an agreement with the EU, which may or may not come to pass, depending on the result of the general election. But I think the risk of a disorderly Brexit, most people would say, has gone down slightly. And the other one was about the adverse impact from changes in local government funding. Since the last report to this committee, we had the announcement from the government that next year's funding settlement would basically just be the same as this year's, but rolled forward to allow for inflation. So we've got a lot more certainty now about the position for the financial year 2021, which is positive. There's still uncertainty about subsequent years, 21, 22 onwards. But in the short term, the position is slightly risky. So I've downgraded that risk. And those are the changes. There's a number of other things in the risk register, but there's nothing else amongst the risks which I think merits changing, and no new risks on the horizon that are worth bringing to members' attention, but we do need to keep constantly on the alert for things that might throw us off course.
Members, are there any questions? Councillor Perry?
Thank you. Yes, just a couple of points, really. Business rates, it seems to be a big issue in the discussions in the upcoming general election. And I'm not making a political comment here, it's just the observation of what might happen to us as a local council in terms of whichever government gets in, what they might do to that. And I'm wondering, that might be quite a big issue still. And the other one is back to the dreaded B word, Brexit. Yes, we could have a withdrawal agreement, but that's only the start. That's only the divorce negotiations. The real issue is the trade agreement, and that hasn't even started yet. That still remains a risk, because if we can't get a trade agreement with the EU, then obviously that throws a lot of issues around. And so I think we need to bear both those points in mind, I think. Thank you.
I'll comment on the business rates point. I think you're absolutely right, Councillor Perry, that there's obviously there'll be pressure on any government to reduce the burden of business rates. And you've probably seen that what's happened until now with the various business rates reliefs that governments have offered is that they've compensated local authorities for those. So we've been insulated, but of course that's just been where they've been kind of tinkering with business rates around the edges. I think if business rates were to disappear, that would pose a big issue, because I mean, business rates is an important source of local government funding. How else would local government be funded? And yes, all the things that people are saying about business rates haven't really addressed that side of the equation. How else would you do it? I mean, it's not actually a particularly good way of funding local government, I don't think, because the services that we provide as a local authority actually don't bear much relation to what business rates pay for. I mean, businesses pay huge amounts in business rates. Actually, what do they get from us in terms of the services that we provide? So there's a bit of a mismatch there between business rates as a source of income and what the council offers. So I don't think it's a bad thing that it's being looked at by the political parties, but clearly there has to be something to take its place if local government's to be funded properly.
Councillor Daly.
Well, Chairman, risk is the big unknown, isn't it, always? Time sometimes teaches you that things that you dreamt or never dreamt could ever happen, do happen, and things that you thought could possibly happen, don't. And those are the two sides of the risk coin. And I look down this list, and I see the ones which I think are the most difficult for us to judge are outside our control, totally outside our control. And anybody who was around, remember the 1980s, in 1985, 1986, I think, the rate of inflation, general rate of inflation was running at between 17 and 20%. 17, you couldn't, it's lasted, you know, it's in this 2-3% thing, it's been bumping along for some years now. What we've spoken about it here before, our projections are for the next 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years around about that 2 to 2.5% inflation. But disorderly Brexit or no Brexit or whatever Brexit means that we just do not know what is going to be the effect on our total GDP. We can't control it, we can't do anything about it, and it's in somebody else's hands. But these things here, so the inflation rate predictions could be inaccurate, and we've got that problem to face. And then there comes constraints on council tax increases. We could never have imagined years ago that the revenue support grant would be withdrawn. You know, it was just one thing that went on and on and on, and now it's gone completely. But the government is still saying you can't go above 2%, 3% or whatever, you know, your stuff. And it's making councils now begin to go bust, which we never thought would happen. Don't talk about Northamptonshire. You know. So constraints on that. Then we come to the business rates business. And because, again, of government pressure, we are actually selling, well, it's not selling off in a way, we are reducing the amount of employment opportunity by the changing of office accommodation into housing. So if there were business opportunities, those business opportunities are not going to be there because the buildings have gone into some other use, and the business rates, therefore, are not available. So all this business about who takes what and who tops the thing, all these things are uncertainties to a point where I think all of them are one massive risk. Of course, they've got so many bits attached to them, which we have no control over whatsoever. So whilst they're all on here, and the bottom one, K, increased complexity of government regulation. Is there ever such a thing? You know, so Mark, I do, you know, how you sleep at night, I don't know, but I mean, but the thing is, these risks are absolutely bottom of our, I mean, we've got a line under which we can't go, and we can't go above it because we've got no idea what the next government or whoever's government after December the 12th is going to do to us. We've got no idea. So how will you counter this?
Crystal ball.
Answers on a postcard, please.
Members, are there any other questions? Councillor.
On page 81 that Councillor Delly just referred to, it's interesting if you look at the, and this is a good but coarse, and that's not meant to be offensive, a good but coarse endeavour to weight the various risks. It's interesting to see that the top three, J, H and N are really out with your control, our control. Leaving J, capital programme cannot be funded, as the clear winner, if you want to put it that way, in terms of this course weighting, which reinforces the point that we touched on the previous agenda item. Is it not time that we should recommend that the Council takes a fairly urgent look to not put its capital programme at risk?
And by saying we shouldn't put it at risk, you're proposing that we go out and borrow. Yeah. As I said in response to the previous question, Councillor Cooling, we monitor the situation very closely. I mean, at the moment, there doesn't seem to be an issue about availability of funding. I think it's right that it be flagged up as a risk, but I feel that we shouldn't, and this is backed up by the advice of our professional financial advisors. It would be wrong to go out and borrow money and then just have it sitting there earning no interest. That would cost the council a lot of money.
Members, are there any other questions? No? In that case, then we turn to the recommendations on page 74. There is one recommendation that is to note. Is that noted? Thank you. Turning to the final agenda item then, agenda item 17 on page 89. Mr. Hartgrove, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. We've had a member briefing before tonight's meeting and gone through the Redmond Review in some length, so I don't propose to go through the report again, as good as it is. And before I go any further, I think I'd just like to say that what we're actually covering in this report is criticisms of the regime, and it's not any way an implied direct criticism against Grant Thornton or indeed our local audit team. In fact, most of my experience over the last 5 years or so has been with one of Grant Thornton's rivals, so that's formulated some of my opinions. So the detail in terms of the report is covered on pages 94 through to 110, with the consultation document itself attached at Appendix 1. The scope of the Redmond Review then, technically known as the independent review into the arrangements in place to support the transparency and quality of local authority financial reporting and external audit in England. It's basically covered in two parts, which is a strategic call for views, focusing on what the users of accounts expect from local authority accounts production and the audit process, and also a technical call for views, which asks for views on the detailed statutory and professional frameworks underpinning the audit and financial reporting framework. As I say, the details in the report, both parts 1 and part 2 of the report. We look at the issues themselves, taking it on a chapter by chapter basis, looking at what the actual chapters themselves covers, but also make a number of local observations as to what the position is, or is here at Maidstone, or our local perception, if you like, or professional perception. And it raises a few questions, a range of key areas of specific local interest or concern. And these include the expectation gap, a perceived difference between what users of the financial statements and other stakeholders expect from an audit and what an audit is actually required to deliver. There's often, for example, the average person in the street might believe that an audit is expected to uncover any instances of fraud, for example, and that's not part of the specific scope of the audit. Also, the current size and complexity of local authority financial statements. You will have seen through this committee itself that the actual size of the statements now typically approaching and indeed breaching 100 pages. They are pretty voluminous documents, not to mention their complexity. And also the scope of the value for money opinion. There's some debate raging about the scope of that opinion. Should it, for example, be a little more forward-looking than it is at the moment and consider subjects such as the financial resilience of the council? It's just something that it doesn't cover at the moment. And also, and this is a thorny issue, the balance between reduction in audit fees and the quality of outputs. It's a fact that audit fees have dropped through the floor in recent years, and I've reached the opinion, and I think most people I speak to on the subject conclude the same, that maybe the balance has got a little bit out of kilter between the decline in audit fees and the quality of external audit outputs. So that's all I intend to say, other than just to pick up on a correction on the the recommendation on page 90, number 2. Apologise that number 2 ought to be replaced with the following, that the committee delegates authority to the Director of Finance and Business Improvement in consultation with the Chairman of the Audit, Governance and Standards Committee to finalise the draft consultation response prepared by officers following this meeting prior to submission in accordance with the 20th of December 2019 deadline. I apologise for my constitutional faux pas on that point. So.
Members, are there any questions? Councillor Daly.
John, I see the need for it, but I'm surprised by it, actually, because I thought that the system of auditing was so set in stone that everybody knew exactly what it did, how it did it, what the outcome should be, and the peculiar language that you would tend to put into the bottom, unqualified this, and all the other funny things. But it's something which has been with us for so long that perhaps it needs review. I mean, I just don't know. But it seems to me that the questions which are asked in here are fairly simple to answer under normal circumstances. And yet we do have, don't we, examples where in some instances local authorities have in fact fallen foul of their financial arrangements and have begun to fail. So I think that it is essential that we do respond to this and respond to it positively, and I hope we will. And it would be interesting to know how many of the 300 and number are actually going to do the same, because one or two of them might duck the issue. I don't know that, but we certainly won't, because I don't think we've got much to duck. So I think that I do hope that this committee is going to come up behind this and get it going. It is obviously necessary to be done, as I say, but I'm surprised by it because of the length that auditing and general practice of financial nature has been in place. So there we go.
Members, are there any other comments? Councillor.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yes, I agree with Councillor Daly, actually, a lot. It did surprise me rather. I think the issues come down to one or two basic points, and I think it was well put earlier on by our external audits about the cost versus the quality issue. There seems to be an obsession that seems to have crept in, and I think that certainly hasn't been helpful in the whole business. I also think it's become local authority accounts are different, you know, it's another world a little bit. And I think some of the requirements of the audit are quite complex, actually. You're asked to do an awful lot of different things, and I think sometimes we forget what the prime purpose of an audit, really external audit, is to ensure it's basically what I use the word stewardship. You know, it's looking at the financial state of the organisation and addressing that. But it's gone into this value for money, you know, all these other different things. And I think sometimes the old saying less is more is sometimes better. And I think in doing all this, I think we want to avoid it becoming even more complex, because I think there's always a danger in this. I mean, I'm about to go to Brussels on business, and I've got to have some dealings with the European Commission, and I know exactly that they have a tendency to make things more and more complicated by building up all the time and it's and it can get easily out of control, I think. So I do welcome this approach, and I certainly support the recommendation that's in the working paper, which I think is right. But less is more. I think just avoid the complexity and concentrate on the prime objectives of what we want from an external audit, because we've got a very detailed internal audit support here as well. And I think the external audit needs to concentrate on what it does best, what it does well. Thank you.
Councillor.
Well, to follow the same spirit as less is more, I'd like to move what's on the papers.
Thank you. Councillor Cooling.
Just wanted to check in the session in the other room. Mark, Mr. Green, said that we would be able to see a draft of the response document fairly soon, so that it might inform our comments upon it and any personal comments we put into this consultation. And I think that's very important, because on page 92, paragraph 2.2, it says the extent to which local authority accounts and the local authority audit process allows users of the accounts to hold local authorities to account. So I think it's unfair for MBC officers to respond totally on behalf of the borough, including the residents, who are in the last analysis, the financiers for the borough. So I do ask for confirmation that we will see a draft fairly soon, and I would ask that in the recommendation it's perhaps noted that the chairman of this committee will receive any comments from us on that draft and give them appropriate weight. Thank you.
Councillor Atkinson.
Yeah, sort of belong this, but on page 101, the very last paragraph, I think it's quite important, because it talks about financial resilience. I mean, the audit of Northamptonshire Council clearly implied that they had no financial resilience, and yet the report was just hidden away and not brought to members. So I think those sorts of reports should actually, there should be some sort of compulsory way of making them be brought to the public so that the public is aware of what's going on. Because, I mean, Northamptonshire Council, they were actually, as I understand it, using Section 106 money to pay their staff. I mean, that's almost fraudulent, isn't it? So that sort of thing should actually be made public rather than sort of hidden away, so that no one knows what's going on. So, I think that's quite important, actually, that is publicised.
Thank you. Liz Jackson, do you want to come?
I was going to say, we weren't the auditors of Northamptonshire, it was KPMG, and they did, as you said, make public reports on the issue. And I just wanted to say that actually that's one of the really important roles that you have as the committee, that actually KPMG did report every year, I think for 3 years, about the decline in the services and actually how where the future forecast was going. And actually it's then your role as members to actually hold that to account and actually use that in the way that it needs to be used. So I think actually you made a really interesting point about actually your role as the committee, approving the accounts and actually getting the reports from us, internal audit, and actually holding officers to account, and actually us as the people who are reporting to you.
May I just make a comment which won't any? I'd like to draw Councillor Perry's attention to pages 135 and 136, where I suggest we don't discuss it, but they raise the subject of materiality.
We're just working on the wording for your recommendation to ensure it's included on the final
Well, I
report.
apologise if it's complicated. I don't want to delay us anymore. But,
Do you want to check with Councillor Cooling, are you satisfied that if we keep the recommendations as they are, but we'll just send you the response outside of this, is that sufficient?
not a problem, and providing I have your assurance that as chair, when you review Mark's excellent draft, that you'll take on board any comments and give due weight to them that we pass in.
Perfect, thank you, we'll do it that way. In that case then, turning to the recommendations on page 90, keeping them as they are, but amending recommendation 2 as per what Mr Hartgrove said at the start. Are they both agreed? Agreed. Thank you, members. In that case, I now declare the meeting closed. Have a safe journey home. Thank you.